Ethan Walsh sat in his favorite upscale restaurant, sipping wine, his eyes narrowing on the woman who had just walked in. She didn't belong here, at least not in his world. With a condescending smile, he leaned over to his colleague and muttered a remark that would change his life forever. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Ethan Walsh moved through life like a man destined to win. At 45, he had built a reputation as one of the top defense attorneys in the country, not because he was always right, but because he knew how to play the game. The courtroom was his stage, his domain, where his confidence and cunning could outmaneuver opponents time and again. To him, success was a matter of intellect and the ability to read the weaknesses of others. And in his view, some people were weaker simply by their very nature. That particular evening, Ethan was seated at one of his favorite spots in town, a restaurant so exclusive that tables were reserved weeks in advance, even for the city's wealthiest and most connected individuals. The air inside was rich with the scent of perfectly seared steaks and the low murmur of quiet, controlled conversation. This was the kind of place where deals were made over glasses of deep red wine, where people like Ethan felt their power, their worth, recognized in every respectful nod from the staff. As he sat with a fellow attorney, James, discussing the latest developments in a high-profile case, his attention drifted toward the entrance. A woman had just walked in, her presence striking in a subtle way. She didn't dress to draw attention. Her outfit was professional, understated, and yet something about her demeanor, the calm confidence with which she carried herself, caught Ethan's eye. She was black, with smooth brown skin and natural curls that framed her face. There was nothing particularly unusual about her, but in this environment, one populated almost exclusively by white men in expensive suits, she stood out. Ethan narrowed his eyes, watching as she moved across the room. She sat down at a table by herself, her back straight, her face serene as she opened the menu. "Do you see that?" Ethan muttered to James, tipping his head toward the woman's table. James glanced up and shrugged. "What?" "That," Ethan repeated, lowering his voice but keeping it just loud enough to ensure his words might be overheard. "What do you think she's doing here? Must have gotten lost on the way to the mall." James chuckled uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh at the remark or let it slide. But Ethan pressed on, feeling emboldened by his own joke. He had always been good at reading a room, understanding the unspoken rules that governed it, and this woman, whoever she was, didn't fit. The woman, though her eyes were still on the menu, subtly tilted her head, her body language showing that she had heard the comment. Ethan, feeling a flicker of satisfaction that his words had landed, leaned back in his chair and sipped his drink, smirking. But as the woman stood, clearly preparing to leave, she moved directly toward Ethan's table. There was a moment of tension, the space between them tightening as she walked past, and just as she came alongside him, she stopped, her eyes met his, and for the briefest of moments, Ethan saw something there that unsettled him. It wasn't anger, nor was it the kind of defensive posture he had expected. Instead, there was a calmness, an almost dismissive sort of dignity, as though she had seen men like him 100 times before and had long ago stopped being affected by their barbs. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Ethan said, his voice dripping with condescension. The woman's lips curved into a faint smile, her gaze unwavering. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied, her tone steady, unflinching. There was no aggression in her voice, only a quiet certainty. "The question is, are you?" Before Ethan could process the remark, she turned and walked away, leaving him stunned. For a moment he sat frozen, the weight of her words lingering in the air. James shifted awkwardly in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the exchange, but Ethan forced a laugh, waving the incident away as if it were of no consequence. "People these days," he muttered, though his voice lacked the confidence it had just moments earlier. The evening went on, but Ethan couldn't shake the brief encounter from his mind. He had been insulted in subtle ways before, mostly by rivals in the courtroom or business competitors. But this had been different. There had been no malice in her tone, no attempt to put him in his place. Instead, she had left him questioning something he rarely questioned, his own standing, his right to judge others as though he were somehow superior. Several weeks passed, and the memory of that night faded into the background of Ethan's busy life. After all, he was a man with important things to focus on: cases to win, clients to impress, and a lifestyle to maintain. His firm had just landed a significant client, Cosford Corp, a powerful corporation facing a major lawsuit. They were being accused of discriminatory practices, and Ethan had been tasked with defending them. It was the kind of case that Ethan thrived on: complicated, high stakes, with millions of dollars on the line. Cosford's management was adamant that the accusations were baseless, a ploy by disgruntled former employees looking for a payout. Ethan was more than willing to take on the challenge. He had built a career out of protecting corporations from such lawsuits, spinning narratives that undermine the credibility of the plaintiffs and swaying juries to see things his way. To him, it was simple. Everyone had a price, and everyone had a weakness. His job was to find that weakness and exploit it. He entered the courtroom on the first day of the trial with his usual confidence, a calm, authoritative presence in his impeccably tailored suit. The room was filled with reporters, all eager to cover the high-profile case, and Ethan relished the attention. He exchanged pleasantries with the judge and his colleagues, flashing a practiced smile that had won over many a jury in the past. As he approached his table, he barely glanced at the opposing counsel. He had read the names on the docket but hadn't paid them much mind. After all, this was a standard civil rights case, one he had handled many times before. But when the opposing counsel finally rose to introduce themselves, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Nia James, representing the plaintiffs," she said, her voice ringing through the courtroom with calm authority. Ethan's eyes widened. It was her, the woman from the restaurant, the same woman he had so callously insulted. For a brief moment, Ethan felt a cold rush of realization sweep over him. The smug confidence he had brought with him into the courtroom wavered. He stared at Nia, who had not even glanced in his direction. She was focused, professional, and entirely in control. Ethan quickly composed himself, brushing off the moment of uncertainty. So what if she was the opposing counsel? It didn't change anything. He was still Ethan Walsh, one of the best defense attorneys in the business. This was his domain, and he wasn't about to be intimidated by a woman he had misjudged. And yet, as the trial began and Nia presented her opening statement, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer as sure of himself as he had once been. The woman standing before him wasn't the person he had arrogantly assumed her to be. She was sharp, poised, and clearly prepared for a fight. For the first time in his career, Ethan found himself doubting whether he could win. In the weeks following that fateful encounter, Ethan had returned to his comfortable life without giving Nia James much thought. After all, she was just one more person who had crossed his path, a fleeting presence in a sea of faces. But the memory of her calm response to his casual insult occasionally crept into his mind, like a whisper in the background. He dismissed it each time, unwilling to entertain the idea that he might have underestimated her. Ethan had bigger concerns. The firm's newest case had come in, and it was massive. Cosford Corp, a well-established and influential corporation, was embroiled in a lawsuit accusing them of systematic racial discrimination against employees of color. The allegations had spread like wildfire, gaining media attention and sparking public outrage. Dozens of employees had come forward, sharing stories of mistreatment, unequal pay, and blatant disregard for their complaints. It was a public relations nightmare for Cosford, but for Ethan, it was an opportunity. Defending high-profile corporations was what he did best. His strategy was simple: paint the plaintiffs as disgruntled employees seeking revenge and money. He had done it before and knew the exact formula to win: undermine their credibility, shift the focus to corporate policies that promoted fairness, and cast doubt on their motives. Juries, he believed, could be easily swayed with the right combination of rhetoric and evidence. As he prepared for the case, Ethan's arrogance grew. He saw it as just another chance to prove himself, to protect a powerful corporation from what he considered baseless accusations. He was ready for a courtroom battle, but nothing could have prepared him for the shock he felt when he saw the opposing counsel. The moment Nia James stood in the courtroom and introduced herself as the lawyer representing the plaintiffs, Ethan's world shifted. It wasn't just that she was the woman from the restaurant. It was that she carried herself with such authority, such confidence, that it caught him off guard. The last time he had seen her, he had dismissed her as an insignificant annoyance. Now she stood as his equal, perhaps even his superior, in a courtroom where his usual tricks might not work. Ethan forced himself to remain composed, to keep the smirk on his face that had become his signature. But internally something was gnawing at him, something unfamiliar. It wasn't fear exactly, but a deep sense of unease. The trial began with opening statements. Ethan went first, as was typical for the defense in civil cases. He stood before the jury, his voice smooth and confident, laying out the foundation for what he hoped would be a winning argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Ethan began, moving slowly across the room with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. "What we have here is a case of misunderstanding, miscommunication, and ultimately a desire for financial compensation under the guise of discrimination." He paused, letting his words sink in. Cosford Corp has always prided itself on being an equal opportunity employer. In fact, their policies are some of the most comprehensive in the industry when it comes to diversity and inclusion. The plaintiffs, while certainly entitled to their feelings, are attempting to exploit this situation for their own personal gain. This lawsuit is not about justice, it's about money. Ethan glanced at the jury, noting the nods from some of them, the looks of understanding on their faces. He felt the familiar surge of control, the power of persuasion that he had honed over years of practice. He continued, building his case around corporate policies, training programs, and statistical data that he knew could cast doubt on the plaintiff's claims. When he finished, Ethan sat down, feeling satisfied with his performance. He had laid the groundwork, and now it was Nia's turn to respond. He glanced over at her, expecting to see a hint of nervousness or uncertainty. But Nia was calm, composed, and as she rose from her seat, it was clear she was ready. "Members of the jury," Nia began, her voice steady but filled with an underlying strength that immediately commanded attention. "What we have here is not a misunderstanding or a case of disgruntled employees seeking revenge. What we have is a corporation that has systematically ignored the voices of its employees of color, creating an environment where discrimination has been allowed to fester unchecked." Her words were simple, but their impact was profound. Ethan felt the shift in the room, the way the jury seemed to lean in, hanging on her every word. She wasn't just talking to them, she was engaging with them on a human level, something Ethan had rarely bothered to do in his career. Nia continued, laying out the stories of the plaintiffs in vivid detail. Each one was different, yet the pattern was the same. Black employees being passed over for promotions, given harsher criticism, paid less, and treated with disdain by their superiors. She presented evidence of emails, internal reports, and testimonies that painted a picture of a company that, despite its public declarations of fairness, had failed to protect its most vulnerable workers. Ethan felt the first pang of doubt creep in. This wasn't going to be as easy as he had thought. Over the next few days, the trial proceeded with witness testimonies. Nia called forward several of the plaintiffs, giving them the space to tell their stories. One by one, they described the pain of being ignored, the frustration of knowing they were being treated unfairly, and the fear of speaking out in a workplace that valued them less than their white colleagues. Ethan did what he always did. He cross-examined them, trying to poke holes in their narratives. He questioned their motives, suggested that their performance issues were the reason for their mistreatment, and subtly implied that they were overreacting. But no matter how hard he pushed, Nia was there, countering his arguments with calm precision. Each time he thought he had found a crack, Nia would step in and seal it, her rebuttals concise and powerful. She never lost her cool, never faltered, and Ethan could feel the jury siding with her more and more each day. Outside the courtroom, Ethan's life began to show signs of strain. His usual cool demeanor was starting to crack, though he refused to admit it. His wife, Marla, had noticed his growing distance. Their relationship, already strained by years of Ethan's long work hours and emotional detachment, was nearing a breaking point. Their teenage son, Brandon, had become more vocal about his frustrations with Ethan's work and his father's views on race. "Dad, how can you defend a company like that?" Brandon had asked one evening as they sat together in the living room, the silence between them heavy. Ethan had shrugged, dismissing his son's concerns. "It's not about what they did or didn't do, Brandon. It's about the law. My job is to defend my client, regardless of whether you agree with them or not." Brandon shook his head, clearly disgusted. "You don't care about what's right, do you? You only care about winning." The words stung, though Ethan would never admit it. He had always prided himself on being able to separate his personal feelings from his work. But lately, that line had begun to blur. The case with Cosford was starting to feel personal, and it was becoming harder to maintain the distance that had once come so easily. Back in the courtroom, Nia continued to present her case with methodical precision. As the trial neared its conclusion, Ethan felt the weight of his own choices pressing down on him. He had spent his entire career defending the powerful, often at the expense of the vulnerable, and now, for the first time, he was beginning to question whether it had all been worth it. The trial was far from over, but Ethan knew that something had shifted, both in the courtroom and within himself. Nia had not only challenged him in the courtroom, but had forced him to confront the uncomfortable truths about his own life and beliefs. For the first time in his career, Ethan wasn't sure if he wanted to win. As the trial progressed, Ethan found himself in unfamiliar territory. For the first time in years, he was on the back foot, struggling to maintain control of a situation that seemed to be slipping further and further from his grasp. The courtroom, once his stage where he performed with ease and confidence, now felt hostile, with every move he made countered expertly by Nia James. Nia had proven herself to be more than just an impressive lawyer. She was relentless, intelligent, and driven by something deeper than professional ambition. Her approach was calculated yet compassionate, her arguments both factual and deeply emotional. She had managed to do something Ethan had never thought possible. She had connected with the jury on a personal level. They weren't just hearing about the plaintiff's stories, they were feeling them. In stark contrast, Ethan's usual courtroom tactics, his charisma, his sharp wit, and his ability to twist facts to his advantage were falling flat. He had always prided himself on his ability to manipulate a case, to make the jury see things from his perspective. But now, it seemed, no one was listening. Worse, they were starting to see through him, and that was something Ethan couldn't accept. For days, Ethan tossed and turned at night, unable to shake the growing sense of dread gnawing at him. His thoughts were plagued with memories of his past victories, moments when he had confidently torn apart the opposition's arguments, dismantling cases with surgical precision. But none of those memories brought him comfort anymore. In fact, they haunted him, as if they were reminders of a person he no longer recognized. One afternoon, during a brief recess in the trial, Ethan stepped outside the courthouse to clear his head. The sky above was gray, reflecting the heaviness that had settled over him. He stood on the courthouse steps, watching people pass by, oblivious to the internal storm raging inside him. For years, Ethan had lived in a bubble, a world where his success was measured by his ability to win, regardless of the cost to others. But now, as he looked back on his career, he began to wonder how many lives he had damaged in the process. How many people had he defended who had wronged others? How many times had he justified his actions by telling himself it was just business? The thought unsettled him, but he quickly pushed it aside. Self-reflection was dangerous in his line of work, and Ethan had always been good at compartmentalizing. Still, the feeling lingered, a nagging voice in the back of his mind that refused to be silenced. Back in the courtroom, the trial continued to unfold, and Nia's case only grew stronger. She had presented a series of damning emails between Cosford Corp's executives that clearly demonstrated a pattern of racial bias in their hiring and promotion practices. The emails were laced with coded language, making it clear that the company's leadership viewed their black employees as inferior, despite their public claims of diversity and inclusion. Ethan had tried to object to the emails being admitted as evidence, arguing that they were taken out of context and didn't represent the company's official stance. But Nia had anticipated his move, presenting additional evidence that tied the emails to specific decisions made by the company, decisions that had harmed the plaintiffs in tangible ways. It was a masterful strategy, and the jury was clearly moved by the evidence. Ethan could see it in their eyes, the way they glanced at the plaintiffs with sympathy, the way they nodded along with Nia's arguments. Every day, Ethan felt his grip on the case slipping further, and with it, his confidence. Nia, on the other hand, remained unshaken. Her calm demeanor in the courtroom contrasted sharply with Ethan's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control. She didn't gloat or seek to humiliate him. She simply did her job and did it well. There was a quiet power in the way she conducted herself, never raising her voice, never showing frustration. It was as if she knew she had already won, and now she was just seeing the case through to its inevitable conclusion. Outside the courtroom, Ethan's personal life was also beginning to unravel. His wife, Marla, had grown distant over the years, but now the distance felt insurmountable. Their conversations, once filled with mutual goals and dreams, had devolved into strained exchanges about their son or mundane household matters. Marla, once proud of Ethan's success, had started to question the cost of that success, both for him and for their family. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Ethan came home to find Marla sitting at the kitchen table, her face etched with worry. She was nursing a cup of tea, her fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. "Long day?" she asked, though her tone lacked the warmth it once had. "Yeah," Ethan replied, loosening his tie as he collapsed into a chair across from her. "This case, it's turning out to be more complicated than I thought." Marla looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Perhaps the man she had married, the man she had loved once upon a time. "It's not just the case, Ethan," she said quietly. "It's everything." Ethan frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" Marla sighed, setting her cup down. "You've changed, or maybe you've always been like this, and I just didn't want to see it. But the way you talk about people, about your clients, your opponents, it's like you don't care about anyone anymore. All you care about is winning." Her words stung, cutting deeper than Ethan expected. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to argue that she didn't understand the pressures of his job, but the look on her face stopped him. There was a sadness there, a weariness that spoke of years of watching him become someone she didn't recognize. "I do care," he said finally, though the words felt hollow even to him. Marla shook her head. "If you did, you wouldn't be defending a company like Cosford. You know what they've done. You know the harm they've caused, and yet you're still trying to protect them. Why?" Ethan had no answer for that. The truth was, he didn't know anymore. He had spent so long chasing success, climbing the ranks of his profession, that he had never stopped to ask himself why he was doing it. Winning had become his sole purpose, his measure of self-worth. And now that he was on the verge of losing, both in the courtroom and in his personal life, he wasn't sure who he was without it. Marla stood, leaving her cup on the table. "I'm going to bed," she said softly. "You should think about what kind of person you want to be, Ethan. Because right now, I don't think I can stay married to this version of you." Her words hung in the air long after she had gone upstairs, leaving Ethan alone with the silence. He sat there for a long time, staring at the empty cup in front of him, feeling the weight of her ultimatum pressing down on him. The next day, back in the courtroom, Ethan tried to shake off the conversation with Marla and focus on the trial. But Nia's arguments continued to chip away at his defenses, and the pressure was mounting. He could feel the case slipping out of his control, and no matter how hard he fought, he couldn't seem to regain his footing. During a particularly heated cross-examination, Ethan snapped. He had been questioning one of the plaintiffs, a young black man named Terrence, who had worked at Cosford for 6 years before being passed over for promotion in favor of a less qualified white colleague. "You were reprimanded several times for being late to work, isn't that right?" Ethan asked, his tone sharp. Terrence nodded, his expression calm. "Yes, but... And isn't it true that you were written up for insubordination after an altercation with your supervisor?" "Yes, but..." Ethan cut him off, his frustration bubbling over. So, are we supposed to believe that these reprimands had nothing to do with why you weren't promoted? That it was all about your race? Terrence didn't flinch. Yes, because my white colleagues had the same issues, but they weren't punished the way I was. Ethan opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could, Nia interjected. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness. The judge, who had grown increasingly frustrated with Ethan's aggressive tactics, nodded. Sustained. Mr. Walsh, move on. Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling the sting of the judge's rebuke. He glanced at Nia, who was watching him with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout the trial. There was no smugness in her expression, no satisfaction in his defeat. She was simply doing her job, better than he was, at the moment. For the first time in his career, Ethan felt the sting of impending defeat. It wasn't just the case he was losing, it was his sense of self. Everything he had built, everything he had believed in, was unraveling before his eyes, and he didn't know how to stop it. Ethan Walsh's world was closing in on him from all sides. Each day in court felt like another round in a fight he was destined to lose, and no matter how hard he pushed, no matter how many tactics he tried to deploy, Nia James met him with precision and an unshakable calm. Ethan had always believed that the courtroom was his battlefield, but this time it felt like he was the one being outmaneuvered at every turn. The trial was not just about the law anymore. It had become a reckoning. His life outside the courtroom wasn't faring any better. Marla had grown distant, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension, and his son Brandon had almost entirely withdrawn from him, spending more time at friends' houses than at home. The few times Brandon did engage, it was clear that he disapproved of his father's work, his choices, and perhaps, Ethan feared, of who he had become. The stress was taking its toll on Ethan's health too. His hands shook when he poured his coffee in the mornings, and his once clear thoughts were now a jumble of doubts and anxieties. He had always prided himself on being in control of his career, his life, his future. But now, for the first time, that control was slipping away. The turning point came late one afternoon in the middle of a particularly brutal day in court. Nia had just finished presenting her final witness, a former employee of Cosford who had been a star performer, consistently praised for her work, until, like so many others, she had been passed over for a promotion in favor of a less qualified white colleague. Rachel Matthews, the witness, was a poised, articulate woman in her early 40s. She had been with Cosford for over a decade and had risen through the ranks on merit, or so she had thought. Her testimony was powerful, not just because of the facts she presented, but because of the emotional weight behind them. She spoke not only of her personal experience, but also of the subtle and not-so-subtle ways in which the company's culture had made people of color feel unwelcome and undervalued. Rachel's words resonated with the jury. Ethan could see it in their faces, in the way they leaned forward slightly in their seats, completely engrossed in what she was saying. Even the judge, normally stoic and impassive, seemed moved. Nia had chosen her final witness wisely. Rachel wasn't angry or accusatory, she was simply telling the truth, and that truth was damning. When it was Ethan's turn to cross-examine, he found himself hesitating for the first time. His usual strategy of aggressively questioning the witness didn't feel right. Something about Rachel's quiet dignity, the way she spoke without bitterness but with a deep sense of injustice, made it clear that attacking her would backfire. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie as he approached the witness stand. His mind raced, searching for a way to undermine her credibility without appearing callous. He had always been good at this, turning the tide, planting seeds of doubt. But today, his usual confidence was absent. "Miss Matthews," he began, his voice sounding thinner than he had intended, "you've stated that you were passed over for promotion on more than one occasion. Is that correct?" Rachel nodded. "Yes." "And you believe that the reason you were passed over was because of your race, rather than any issues with your job performance?" "I know it was because of my race," Rachel said evenly. "My performance was never an issue. I received glowing reviews every year, and I consistently exceeded expectations." Ethan paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But isn't it possible that there were other factors at play? Perhaps the positions you were applying for required specific skills or qualifications that the individuals who were promoted had, and you did not. Rachel didn't flinch. No, it's not possible. I trained most of the people who were promoted over me. They didn't have more qualifications than I did. In fact, they often had less experience and fewer skills. Ethan's mind raced, trying to find a way to poke holes in her testimony, but the truth of her words hung heavy in the room. He could feel the jury's attention shifting, the weight of Rachel's experience pressing down on his arguments. For the first time, he realized that no matter what he said, no matter how skilled he was at twisting words and manipulating narratives, there was no undoing the truth in her story. He glanced over at Nia, who was watching him intently. There was no smugness in her expression, no satisfaction in his struggle. She simply watched, as if waiting for him to acknowledge something he had been avoiding all along. The cross-examination ended with little more fanfare. Ethan had done his best to raise doubts, but the damage was already done. Rachel's testimony had struck a chord with the jury, and there was nothing he could do to change that. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom began to empty, with reporters and spectators filing out into the hallway. Ethan remained at his table, staring down at the notes he had scribbled throughout the day, though he had no intention of reviewing them. His mind was elsewhere, caught in a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. He had spent his entire career defending people like Cosford Corp, powerful, wealthy clients who paid him to protect their interests. And in doing so, he had convinced himself that the people on the other side of the courtroom were simply adversaries to be beaten, obstacles in his path to success. But now, faced with the raw honesty of Rachel's testimony and the undeniable facts of the case, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had been fighting for the wrong side. That evening, as he sat in his office, the weight of everything began to crash down on him. The room, once a place where he felt in control, now felt oppressive. The leather-bound books on the shelves, the framed accolades on the walls, the gleaming mahogany desk, they were all reminders of the person he had built himself to be, a person whose worth was measured in wins and losses. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. It was a message from his junior associate, Sarah Rivera, asking if he was available for a quick meeting. Ethan hesitated, then replied with a terse, "Come in." Sarah knocked on the door moments later, stepping into the office with an air of nervousness. She was young, in her late 20s, and had only recently joined the firm. But she was smart, ambitious, and had quickly proven herself to be one of the firm's rising stars. "Mr. Walsh," she began, standing just inside the doorway, "I wanted to talk to you about the trial. I know it's not my place, but—" Ethan waved a hand, gesturing for her to sit. "Go ahead, Sarah. Say what's on your mind." Sarah took a seat, her posture straight but clearly tense. "I've been following the case closely, and I've seen the way things are going in the courtroom. I think we're losing this one, sir. And I don't think it's because we're not good enough lawyers. I think it's because the other side is right." Ethan stared at her, taken aback by her directness. Junior associates didn't usually speak to senior partners like this, but there was something in Sarah's tone, a mix of conviction and concern, that made him listen. "I know we're supposed to defend our clients, no matter what," Sarah continued, her voice growing more confident. "But sometimes the truth is bigger than the case. And the truth here is that Cosford Corp has been discriminating against their employees for years. We've seen the evidence, we've heard the testimonies, it's undeniable." Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He had known, deep down, that what Sarah was saying was true. But hearing it out loud, from someone on his own team, forced him to confront the reality he had been avoiding. "So what are you saying?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter than usual. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes filled with something Ethan hadn't seen in a long time: idealism. "I'm saying that maybe it's time to stop fighting for the wrong side." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan didn't respond right away. He simply sat there, absorbing the weight of what Sarah had said. She was right, of course. He had known it for a while now, but pride, ego, and years of success had kept him from admitting it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan nodded. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll think about it." Sarah rose to leave, but before she exited, she paused at the door, glancing back at him. "Whatever you decide, Mr. Walsh, I think you're a good lawyer. but I think you could be a great one if you chose to fight for the right reasons." And with that, she left the room, leaving Ethan alone once again with his thoughts. That night, Ethan sat in his living room, staring at the flickering glow of the television, though he wasn't paying attention to the news playing in the background. Marla had already gone to bed, and the house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt truly lost. He had built a career on winning, on defending the powerful and the wealthy, and now that foundation was crumbling. But more than that, he was beginning to realize that the person he had become was not the person he wanted to be. He thought about Nia, about the quiet dignity with which she had fought for her clients, never once stooping to the levels Ethan had become so accustomed to. She was doing something bigger than just winning a case. She was fighting for justice. And for the first time in his life, Ethan wondered what it might feel like to be on the right side of that fight. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation as the jury prepared to deliver its verdict. Ethan sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. His outward composure hadn't cracked, but inside, a storm raged. He had spent the last few nights in a state of restless turmoil, replaying every moment of the trial, every decision he had made, every word he had said. Now, it all came down to this. Across the room, Nia James sat beside her clients, her face calm, her posture as poised as ever. She hadn't needed to ask for confidence. She had earned it. From the very beginning, she had been in control, presenting her case with clarity and conviction. Ethan couldn't help but feel a strange mix of admiration and envy toward her. She had managed to do what he had failed to do for so long, remain true to herself and her principles. The judge entered the courtroom, and the jury foreman rose, holding the folded piece of paper that contained the verdict. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of how much was at stake, not just for his client, but for himself. He glanced over at his team, his junior associates, paralegals, and assistants, each of them waiting anxiously for the outcome. It felt as though the entire room was holding its breath. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice low but commanding. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, his voice steady. Ethan clenched his jaw, preparing for the worst, even as he tried to maintain a shred of hope. The trial had been long and brutal, and he knew the odds were no longer in his favor. He had fought as hard as he could, deploying every strategy, every legal maneuver he had learned over the years. But Nia's case had been airtight. The evidence of Cosford Corp's systematic racial discrimination was overwhelming, and despite his best efforts to twist the narrative, the truth had been too powerful to deny. The foreman cleared his throat, unfolding the paper. "In the case of Cosford Corp versus the plaintiffs, we find the defendant guilty of racial discrimination." A wave of emotion rippled through the courtroom. Ethan felt a rush of heat flood his face, his stomach churning as the weight of the words sank in. Guilty. It was a verdict he had avoided hearing for most of his career, a word that had always signified failure in his eyes. But today, as those words echoed in the air, something inside him shifted. The judge thanked the jury and moved on to the next phase. Discussing the terms of the settlement Cosford Corp would be required to pay to the plaintiffs. Nia's clients sat in stunned silence, tears welling in their eyes as they realized they had won. They had been fighting this battle for years, and now, finally, justice had been served. Nia stood and quietly embraced her clients, her face a mixture of quiet satisfaction and relief. Ethan watched her, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. This was the moment he had spent his entire career trying to avoid, a public, undeniable defeat. And yet, as he sat there watching the plaintiffs celebrate, he didn't feel the crushing blow of failure he had expected. Instead, there was a strange sense of clarity, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. After the verdict was announced, the courtroom emptied out slowly, the plaintiffs and their families celebrating outside the courthouse while reporters swarmed, eager for quotes and sound bites. Ethan stayed behind, gathering his files with slow, deliberate movements. His mind was a jumble of thoughts, frustration, regret, but also, surprisingly, a sense of resignation. He had lost, but there was a part of him that knew this loss was different. It wasn't the kind of defeat that would end his career. It was the kind that could change it. Nia approached him as he stood to leave. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the now empty courtroom, two lawyers on opposite sides of a fight that had just come to a close. Ethan wasn't sure what to expect, perhaps a moment of triumph from Nia, a subtle reminder of her victory over him. But when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost kind. "Ethan," she said, "I know this wasn't easy for you." He looked at her, surprised by the empathy in her tone. "You were right, Nia," he admitted, the words coming out slower than he intended. "You've been right from the beginning." Nia didn't gloat, didn't rub salt in the wound. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes searching his face. "This wasn't about winning or losing for me," she said quietly. "It was about doing the right thing." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. Those words, "doing the right thing," hit him harder than any courtroom defeat ever could. He had spent so many years chasing victories, measuring his worth by the number of cases he had won, that he had forgotten what it meant to fight for something meaningful, something just. Nia had shown him that, and as much as it pained him to admit it, he was grateful. "I lost this case," he said, his voice tinged with regret, "but I think I gained something more important." Nia smiled, a small, genuine smile that softened the tension between them. Maybe that's the real victory. With that, she extended her hand. Ethan hesitated only for a moment before shaking it. There was no animosity between them, only mutual respect. And in that handshake, Ethan realized that this wasn't the end of his career. It was a new beginning. In the weeks following the trial, Ethan's life changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. Cosford Corp, embarrassed by the highly publicized verdict, severed ties with Ethan's firm, along with several other high-profile clients. It was a blow to the firm's finances, and Ethan's name, once synonymous with victory, now carried the sting of defeat. But rather than despair, Ethan found himself feeling something unexpected: relief. For the first time in his life, Ethan no longer felt trapped by the need to constantly win, to be the most successful, the most feared attorney in the room. He had spent decades defining himself by those external measures, but now, standing at a crossroads, he realized there was more to life, and to his career, than victory at all costs. His relationship with Marla, once strained to the point of breaking, began to mend. The trial had forced Ethan to confront his own beliefs, to see the damage his arrogance and prejudice had done not just to his clients but to his family. Marla, sensing the change in him, had softened. Conversations that had once been stilted and full of resentment now had room for honesty and growth. It wasn't an instant fix, but they were slowly rebuilding what had been lost. Brandon, too, began to see his father in a new light. After the trial, Ethan had sat down with his son, explaining the case and his role in it, not as the lawyer trying to win, but as a man who had been wrong, who was learning to see the world differently. Brandon had listened, his arms crossed, his face a mask of teenage skepticism. But when Ethan finished, there was a brief moment of understanding in his son's eyes, a glimpse of hope that perhaps his father was changing after all. Several months later, Ethan found himself sitting in his office, staring at a blank piece of paper on his desk. He had left the large firm where he had spent most of his career, choosing instead to open a smaller practice. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about finding meaning in the work he did, about fighting for clients who needed help, not just those who could afford to pay the most. He had been approached by several potential clients since the trial, including some who were facing their own discrimination suits. But the case that had captured his attention was one that hit closer to home. A group of workers who were suing their employer for unsafe working conditions, many of whom were immigrants or people of color. Ethan had agreed to take the case, not because it was high profile or lucrative, but because it was the right thing to do. As he sat there contemplating the future, a knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Sarah Rivera, the junior associate who had spoken so candidly to him during the Cosford trial. She had stayed with him after the trial, choosing to join him in his new practice. Ethan had come to respect her immensely, not just for her legal skills, but for her integrity and conviction. "Ready for the meeting?" Sarah asked, stepping into the office. Ethan nodded, smiling. "Yeah, let's do this." They walked together into the conference room where their new clients were waiting. As Ethan shook hands with the workers, listening to their stories, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about justice. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. Months passed, and Ethan's transformation continued. His new practice flourished, not because he sought out wealthy clients or high-profile cases, but because he had found a way to align his skills with his conscience. He no longer viewed his clients as mere chess pieces in a game of strategy. He saw them as people. People who needed help, people who deserved justice. Word of Ethan's change in direction spread quickly, and while some of his old colleagues sneered at his decision to go soft, others quietly admired his courage. The truth was, many of them had felt the same emptiness that had once plagued Ethan, but few had the bravery to walk away from the allure of money and power. One evening, as Ethan was closing up his office, he received a letter in the mail. It was from Nia James. She had moved on to another high-profile case, but had taken the time to write a brief note. Ethan, I always believed you were a great lawyer, but now I think you've become a better man. Best. Nia. Ethan smiled, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into his jacket pocket. He stood at the window, watching the fading light of the city, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. In the end, karma hadn't just caught up with Ethan Walsh. It had given him the chance to become the person he was always meant to be. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.